It was a Tuesday evening, and I just sat down with a cold beer, ready to relax, when there was a knock at the door. Odd, since Jessica was out, and I wasn't expecting any company. I got up and opened the door, and there, on the doorstep, was a package. No return address, no shipping label, just my name, scribbled hastily across the top. Suspicious, right? But of course, curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it up, half thinking it might be a mistake in delivery. Inside was a small brown envelope, and when I tore it open, my heart started pounding as I pulled out a stack of photos. They were grainy but clear enough to make out the figures. Jessica was in each one, smiling at some guy I'd never seen before, leaning in close, their faces almost touching. In the last photo, taken from the backseat of what looked like his car, they were kissing, plain as day. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the photos, trying to process what I was looking at. It all felt so surreal, like it was happening to someone else. The Jessica in those pictures wasn't the woman I thought I knew. She looked happy, almost glowing, a look I hadn't seen in a while now that I thought about it. The shock faded fast, replaced by this intense wave of anger and betrayal. I stuffed the photos back in the envelope, poured myself another drink, and tried to make sense of it all. My head was spinning. Was this some kind of twisted prank? A scam? But deep down, I knew the truth was staring me right in the face. An hour later, Jessica came home, laughing at something on the phone as she walked in, not even noticing me at first. She stopped dead in her tracks when she finally saw me standing there, envelope in hand, like I'd seen a ghost. "Who is he?" I asked, cutting right to the chase. Her face went pale. She glanced at the envelope, then back at me, and for a moment she was speechless. Finally, she stammered, What are you talking about?" "What am I talking about?" I said, holding up the envelope and spilling the photos onto the table. "I'm talking about these. You, him, together, in his car, kissing. Care to explain?" Her mouth opened and closed, like she was searching for the right words, and her face twisted, like she was trying to summon tears, but I wasn't buying it. At last, she muttered, "It's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like," I repeated, bitterness seeping into every word. "So, you're not sneaking around with some guy behind my back?" Jessica hesitated. Then, just when I thought she might tell me the truth, she came out with the same excuse I'd heard 1,000 times. "He's just a friend." The fury that hit me right then, it was like nothing I'd ever felt. I looked at her, struggling to keep my cool, to not let her see how much this was ripping me apart. "Look," she said, her voice softening, almost pleading. "I know how it looks, but it's not what you think. Work's been stressing me out, and he's just someone I can talk to. He listens. That's all. Just someone to talk to?" I asked, my voice like ice. She nodded, trying to keep her eyes wide and innocent, as if she really thought I'd believe her. But the proof was right there in my hands, literally in black and white. I stood there, watching Jessica try to spin this into something harmless, and my mind was racing, flashing back to every moment between us lately, every excuse, every time she'd brushed me off. Those photos were like the missing pieces of a puzzle, showing me a picture I could never unsee. "All right," I said slowly, struggling to keep my voice steady. "If he's just a friend, why don't you tell me about him? What's his name? Where'd you meet?" She looked down, sighed, and finally mumbled, "His name is Tom. He's from work." Hearing her say his name out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. This wasn't some stranger. He was someone she saw every day, someone she'd brought into her life without me knowing. I felt like I'd been hit by a freight train. "Fine," I said, keeping my tone as level as I could. "Since he's just a friend, why don't we call Tom right now?" Jessica's head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. She forced a laugh, but I could tell she was scrambling. "This is ridiculous, Adam. Seriously? Are you really that insecure? You want me to call him at, what, midnight? Why not?" I pressed, crossing my arms. "If there's nothing going on, let's call him. I'll put it on speaker." And he can explain why my wife is spending so much time in his car. Her mouth set in a hard line. No, I'm not doing that, she snapped, her voice sharper now. I'm not going to let you humiliate me like this. You don't even know the whole story. And here you are, jumping to conclusions. My fist clenched. The whole story? What am I missing, Jessica? Because these photos seem pretty clear. She sighed, looking defeated, and then, finally, she spoke. Fine. Yes, we've been meeting up outside of work. But it's because I'm unhappy, Adam. I've been unhappy for a while now. And Tom, he's just been there for me in a way you haven't. My jaw dropped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was actually making this about me, like it was my fault she'd been sneaking around behind my back. The anger inside me was growing into something darker, something I hadn't felt before. Unhappy? I echoed, disbelief dripping from my voice. And you never thought to tell me this unhappiness? Instead, you just went and turned to some guy from work to spill your heart to? She took a slow, deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper, trying to sound helpless. I didn't plan for this, Matt. It just happened. I never meant to hurt you. I laughed, but it came out harsh, almost bitter. Didn't mean to hurt me? Jessica, if you didn't want to hurt me, you wouldn't be sneaking around, kissing this guy in his car. She looked away, and right then, I saw the truth plain as day. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done, she was sorry she'd been caught. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. All the trust, the loyalty I thought we had, meant nothing to her. Then, as if she couldn't make things worse, she took a breath and muttered, Maybe we should take some time apart, Matt, just to figure things out. It might be good for us. The silence in the room felt thick, like the air was pressing down on us. I was ready to walk out, to let her have her space, to get away and clear my head. But then, just as I was about to go, she added with a tiny, cold smirk, Maybe it'll be good for both of us. That look, so smug, so dismissive, was like a slap to my face. My heart pounded, and every emotion from betrayal to disgust flared up all at once. But somehow, beneath it all, I felt an odd sense of calm, like everything suddenly made sense. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this with that smug smile, not after everything she'd done. All right, Jessica, I said, my voice steady. You want space? Fine. But first, I want the truth. All of it. How long has this been going on? Her smirk wavered, but she kept her chin up, defiant. Matt, you're being dramatic. I already told you, Tom and I are just friends. I couldn't help it. I laughed, shaking my head. Friends? Friends don't meet up in parking lots to make out. Friends don't cling to their phones, texting at all hours. And friends sure as hell don't ask for space right after they get caught cheating. She crossed her arms, her face hardening with that same stubborn look she'd get when she didn't want to admit something. You know what? Believe what you want, Matt. I don't owe you an explanation for every little thing I do. Her words echoed in my head, and that was it, the last straw. I was done with her games. I went to the bedroom, grabbed my keys and jacket, and headed for the door. She followed, her voice loud and demanding, asking where I was going, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of an answer. I got in my car and drove, just letting the anger burn itself out, trying to think about what to do next. Before I knew it, my instincts had taken me straight to her mother's house, her mom, Karen. The last person I'd expected to talk to about any of this was Karen. But right now, she felt like the only person who might actually understand. Karen had always been there for me, more than even my own family at times. She'd check in on me, invite me over for dinner when she knew Jessica was working late. Over the years, we'd become close, and in that moment, she was the one person I needed to see. I pulled into her driveway and just sat there for a second, hesitating. But then the front door opened, and Karen stepped outside, her eyes widening when she saw me. Matt? What are you doing here this late? I got out of the car, and without saying a word, she led me inside. The moment we sat down, everything spilled out of me, the photos, the way Jessica had tried to twist things around on me, and how she had the nerve to ask for space like I was the one who'd wronged her. Karen listened quietly, her expression shifting between shock and sadness as I went on. When I finished, she sighed, shaking her head slowly. Matt, I don't even know what to say. I'm so sorry. I never imagined she'd do something like this. There was a long, heavy silence between us. I wasn't even sure if I'd come here for advice or just to feel like I wasn't losing my mind. But Karen reached over, placed her hand on mine, and said softly, "You don't deserve this, Matt. No one does." The words were so simple, but hearing them from her was like someone finally acknowledging what I was feeling. And then, unexpectedly, I looked at her, really looked, and saw that she was hurting too, just like me. Her own daughter had betrayed her trust, and it showed in her eyes. We sat there, hands joined, both of us lost in the silence. Then, without thinking, without planning, I leaned in. And Karen didn't pull away. It started as just a kiss, a quick impulse. But somehow, it felt like the most real connection I'd had in a long time. That kiss with Karen was like a raw moment of truth, something honest that I hadn't felt in so long. But the second it ended, reality came crashing down on both of us. We pulled away, wide-eyed, caught in the shock of what had just happened. Karen looked down, her face shifting between guilt and surprise, and for a long moment, we just sat there in silence. "Matt," she finally whispered, her voice shaking. We can't." But even as she said it, her hand stayed resting on mine, like she was holding on to something solid, something real. I could see it in her eyes, she felt the same pull I did. We were both hurting, both lost, both scarred by Jessica's betrayal. And here we were, two people trying to escape the pain, reaching out for each other in the most unexpected way. "I know," I murmured. "It's wrong." "I know." But deep down, part of me didn't care. Part of me wanted to drown every last bit of anger and heartache, even if it meant crossing a line I never thought I'd cross. Then, in that stillness, something changed. Karen leaned closer, her eyes meeting mine, as if silently asking, "Are you sure?" My answer was unspoken but clear. We kissed again, and this time, it was different. It wasn't just a reflex. It was as if we were pouring out everything, every bit of betrayal, hurt, loneliness. It was messy, it was wrong, but it felt real. An hour later, we were lying on her living room couch, both of us silent in the thick, complicated air. I glanced over at Karen, wondering if she regretted what had just happened. But instead of guilt, I saw a look that felt almost like relief. She gave me a small, sad smile and reached over to touch my face, her fingers gentle. "I never thought it would come to this," she said softly, her voice breaking a little. "But maybe it's what we both needed." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to say. A part of me felt an odd satisfaction, like I'd reclaimed something Jessica had tried to take. But another part of me was conflicted. This wasn't some stranger, this was her mother. And now, our lives were tangled in a way that couldn't ever be undone. As the clock crept past midnight, I knew I couldn't stay. We both knew it. Karen walked me to the door, her hand lingering on mine a moment longer than necessary. "What are you going to do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think it's time Jessica understands exactly what she's done." Karen nodded, her face full of understanding and a kind of sadness. "If you need me, I'm here," she said gently, her eyes soft with a support that felt comforting, almost healing, after everything. As I stepped out into the night, I felt an unusual sense of clarity. Jessica wanted space? Fine. But she was about to find out that actions have consequences. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache, a mess of emotions, and the realization that I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I'd barely slept, turning the events of the night over in my mind, half wondering if it had all been some surreal dream. But it wasn't. It had been real, Karen's touch, her words, all of it. And now, there was no way to undo it. But strangely, beneath the guilt, there was another feeling, cold and clear, satisfaction. Jessica had pushed me here, bit by bit, with her lies, her betrayal, her arrogance. She wanted me to think I was the problem, that I hadn't been enough. Well, she was about to find out just how enough I could be. When I walked back into the house, Jessica was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone, her face an unreadable mask. She looked up as I walked in, eyeing me with that same calculating stare that had driven me crazy the night before. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice casual, like she was asking about the weather. I looked at her, letting a slight smirk slip. She had no idea. "Oh, I just needed some air," I said, pouring myself a coffee, taking my time. Had a long night of thinking. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting, hoping for more. She rolled her eyes, sighing sharply. "So, are we going to keep doing this, Matt? The whole brooding, mysterious act? It's getting old." I took a long sip of my coffee, savoring every second of her cluelessness. "I could say the same thing about you sneaking around with Tom. But hey, looks like we both had some fun last night." Jessica's face flickered, just for a second, then she shrugged, throwing on her best. "I don't care. Face. I told you already, Matt. I needed someone who actually listens, someone who understands. I shouldn't have to feel guilty about that." The nerve. Here she was, twisting the knife, acting like her betrayal was some kind of self-care routine. I was done with her playing the victim. Leaning forward, I met her gaze, my voice low but steady. "Don't worry, Jess," I said. "I took your advice. Spent some time with someone who actually listens, too." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, really? And who would that be? One of your sad little friends from work?" I let the silence stretch, savoring her arrogance, her complete obliviousness. Then, locking eyes with her, I said, "Your mom." Jess froze, her face going pale. I watched as realization crept in, draining her confidence. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, her mind struggling to grasp what I just revealed. What the hell are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice shaky. "That's not funny, Matt." "Oh, I'm not joking," I said, keeping my tone calm and almost cold. "Last night, I went to see Karen. I told her everything. And well, let's just say things got very close." Her eyes filled with horror and disbelief. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. She was reaching, trying to find some response, some way to regain control. But there was nothing she could say to undo what I just dropped on her. "You're lying," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're just saying this to hurt me. My mom would never, she'd never do something like that." I leaned back, giving her a steady, unblinking stare. "Believe what you want, Jess, but you know me well enough to know when I'm serious. And if you don't, you can go ask her yourself." The room went silent. Her face twisted, torn between disbelief and anger. She looked like she wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I could see the betrayal in her eyes, and for a second, it looked like she was feeling the same sting I had when I discovered those photos. What kind of person are you?" she finally managed, her voice raw with anger. "The kind of person you made me," I replied evenly. She stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her, leaving me with a strange, dark satisfaction. I'd hit her where it hurt the most. And if she thought she could twist this back on me, she was wrong. Jess didn't come back that night. The house was unbearably silent, but instead of relief, I felt an odd emptiness gnawing at me. The satisfaction I'd felt that morning was slipping away, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Regret? Maybe. Or maybe just the cold realization of what I'd set in motion. I'd gone for the jugular, but at what cost? The next morning, I was woken by a loud pounding on the door, my head groggy and disoriented. I opened it to find Jess standing there, flanked by her mother Karen. They both looked furious, but there was something else in Karen's expression, something that almost looked like shame. "Matt," Karen said, her voice trembling. "What did you tell her?" I looked at Jess, her face twisted with rage, her eyes red from what I could only guess had been a long night of tears and fury. "So you came to confirm it, huh?" I said, somehow managing to keep my voice calm. Jess pushed past me, storming into the living room, her fists clenched tight at her sides. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed, barely containing her voice. "You went behind my back with my mother? Do you have any idea what that's done to her? Do you know how humiliated she feels?" Karen stayed in the doorway, her face unreadable. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Matt," she said, barely above a whisper, "I told her it was a mistake. That we shouldn't have." Hearing her say that stung, even though I knew it was true. I forced myself to stay composed. "Mistake or not, it happened," I replied, looking directly at Jess. "Maybe now you're starting to understand what betrayal feels like." Jess's face hardened. "You really think this is the same? You went behind my back with someone who's supposed to be family. Do you even hear yourself?" She looked at me like she didn't recognize the person standing in front of her. I glanced at Karen, who looked down as if she wished she could disappear. Jess noticed and turned on her, her voice dripping with venom. "And you," she spat. "What were you thinking? Are you that pathetic? That desperate?" Karen's face paled, her eyes flashing with hurt, but she stayed silent. I felt anger rising in me. Jess had no right to talk to her mom that way, not after everything she'd done. But before I could speak up, Karen finally did, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know I crossed the line, Jess," she said, her tone soft but firm. "But maybe if you hadn't been sneaking around with someone else, none of this would have happened." Jess recoiled like she'd been slapped. "Are you blaming me? Unbelievable. You're disgusting." A surge of cold fury rose in me. "Disgusting?" I took a step toward her, my voice low and controlled. "After all the lies, the secrets, the sneaking around with David, after treating me like some backup plan she could string along," her anger flickered and, just for a moment, I thought I saw a hint of realization, maybe even regret. But in a heartbeat, she steeled herself again. "I'm not the one who went behind my spouse's back with family," she shot back coldly. "You've broken something that can never be fixed. Whatever this marriage was, it's over." Her finality hit me like a punch, but I wasn't about to let her have the last word. "Fine," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Maybe it should be. But don't act like you're the victim here, Jess. You set this in motion the second you decided to bring someone else into our marriage." She turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving me alone with Karen, who looked like she'd aged a decade in a single day. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, and neither could she. She just looked at me with this sad, apologetic expression, then turned and walked out after her daughter. The silence that settled over the room was thick, suffocating. It was over. Every last piece of the life I'd built with Jess had gone up in flames in a storm of betrayal and revenge. And now, alone in the ashes, I was left wondering if any of it had been worth it. The house felt hollow, the quiet heavier than ever. I sat there staring at the walls, trying to convince myself that scorched earth had been the only way forward. Part of me felt justified. Jess had betrayed me, lied to my face, flaunted her affair like I'd somehow pushed her into it. But now that she was gone, and Karen too, the reality of it all started to sink in. I'd destroyed everything. A couple of hours later, as I was finally starting to settle, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something compelled me to check. The message read, "You don't know who you're messing with, Matt. Leave Jess alone. Or else." I stared at the screen, heart racing, as the pieces clicked into place. David. He knew. Now he was playing the white knight, swooping in to protect Jess after all the mess she'd caused. It was almost laughable. This guy, who barely knew me, suddenly acting like he was in some position to threaten me to defend her. Part of me wanted to call him, tell him exactly how much damage Jess had already done, how she'd blown up both our lives for her selfish little game. But as I looked at the message, an idea took shape, something darker, sharper than anything I'd planned before. I typed out a response, keeping it as calm as I could. "I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation, David. If you want to be with Jess, maybe you should ask her how she feels about family loyalty. I didn't expect a response, but 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. What's that supposed to mean? Perfect. He was already rattled. I took a breath, my fingers steady as I typed. Ask her about her mom. Ask if she's told you everything. This time, silence stretched out for almost 20 minutes. I could only imagine what Jess might be saying to him, how she tried to spin this to cover her tracks. But then his reply came, one final message. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but leave us alone. The irony of it stung. Here he was accusing me of playing games, as if I was the one who turned everything upside down. But that was the thing about people like Jess and David, they could never see their own faults. They'd only ever cast themselves as the victims. And maybe, in some twisted way, they deserved each other, tangled up in the web of lies they'd both woven. I put my phone down, bitterness easing into a cold kind of satisfaction. The fallout was complete. Jess had her freedom now, and I had my closure, or at least something that felt close to it. I could move on, knowing I hadn't just stood by as she tore our marriage apart. I'd taken control, even if it meant reducing everything to ashes. That night, as I finally lay down, the ache in my chest felt duller, replaced by a hollow kind of calm. There was no going back, no repairing what was broken, and no pretending things could ever be the same. But maybe, just maybe, that was what I needed all along. Days passed, each one feeling heavy and strange. I half expected Jess to come back, to try one last shouting match, to demand some kind of closure on her terms. But she was gone, as if she'd vanished completely from my life. The silence was brutal, yet a part of me welcomed it. I needed space to sift through the rubble we'd left behind. Then, just as I was beginning to settle into some kind of rhythm in the emptiness, there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood Karen. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or uneasy. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite read, worry, maybe even fear. Karen? I asked, searching her face. What's going on? She hesitated, glancing down as if trying to gather the right words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she stepped into the house and said, Matt, I don't know how to tell you this, but I think I might be pregnant. Her words struck like a lightning bolt, rattling every part of me. Pregnant. Karen was pregnant. It felt like the ground vanished beneath me. My voice barely came out as I whispered, Are you sure? She nodded slowly, biting her lip, uncertainty clouding her eyes. I haven't told anyone yet, not even Jess, but I took a test yesterday, and it was positive. Her voice broke, and I could see the turmoil flickering in her gaze, the same confusion and fear that had torn through me. For a moment, I couldn't think. My mind raced, trying to wrap itself around what this could mean. A child. Karen's and mine. I'd crossed the line with her that I thought I'd keep buried forever. But now, this was a consequence either of us had been prepared to face. Karen took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper. Matt, I don't know what to do. I don't even know where to start. Jess, she would never forgive either of us if she knew. And there it was, the painful truth hanging in the space between us, the ripple effect of everything we've done. Jess's betrayal, my revenge, the tangled mess that had drawn Karen into this storm, too. And now, there was an innocent life caught in the middle, a life either of us had planned or prepared for. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the weight of the moment press down on us both. Karen, I murmured, my voice hoarse. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. We'll get through this together. She looked at me, relief and fear flooding her eyes all at once. Thank you, Matt. I needed to hear that. As she left, I stood there, staring at the closed door, my mind spiraling with what the future might hold. I had no answers, no plan. All I knew was that this was far from over. This was just the beginning. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a thick fog, the weight of Karen's news pressing down on me every hour. I had no clue how we'd navigate this, or what would happen when Jess inevitably found out. Karen hadn't yet decided if she was going to keep the baby, and the uncertainty added a tension so thick I could hardly breathe. Then, one evening, I got the call I'd both dreaded and expected. It was Jess. Her voice was cold, almost unrecognizable. "Matt, we need to talk. Now." I told her to come over, and within an hour, she was at the door, her expression severe, her eyes narrowed with a look I hadn't seen before. She pushed past me, crossing her arms as she paced the living room, holding herself together through sheer willpower. After a long, tense silence, she turned to face me. "I spoke with my mom," she said, her words heavy in the air. I kept my face neutral, though my mind was racing, trying to piece together how much she knew, or suspected. "Did she tell you everything?" I asked, my voice calm, steady. Jess's face twisted, her eyes flashing with disgust and anger. "She told me about you too," she spat. "Yes. About your pathetic attempt to get back at me by dragging her into your mess. And she told me that she's pregnant." There it was. She knew everything. And even though I'd expected it, her words still cut like a knife, her accusations slicing deeper than I'd anticipated. "Jess," I started, but she cut me off, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how twisted this is, Matt? To go behind my back with my own mother?" She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "And now there's a child on the way? You think this is some kind of poetic justice?" I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay composed. "Jess, you don't get to stand here and play the victim," I shot back. "You're the one who started all of this. You were sneaking around with David, lying to my face. Don't act like you didn't set every part of this in motion." Her face darkened, and for a split second, I thought she might actually hit me. But then her expression shifted, and her voice took on an edge that sent a chill through me. "Fine, Matt. Maybe I deserve some of the blame, but dragging my mother into this?" She shook her head, disgusted. "That's low, even for you." "Low? For me?" I laughed, incredulous. "Jess, you abandoned this marriage, not me. I was here, ready to work through our problems, and you left me in the dark for months. I'm not proud of what happened with Karen, but I'm not going to sit here and let you pretend you're blameless." She shook her head, and her anger twisted into something almost triumphant. "Oh, I'm not pretending anything, Matt," she said, a smirk tugging at her lips. "But just know this, you think you've won by hurting me? You're wrong. Because now, this is a war. And I promise you're going to regret it." With that, she spun around and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating, her threat hanging heavily in the air. Jess wasn't going to let this go. I knew Jess well enough to see she was ready to take this battle to a place where either of us could walk away untouched. The fallout had started, and the days that followed were a spiral into chaos, a blaze I hadn't fully seen coming. Jess's war began faster than I'd expected, and she came in strong. It started with phone calls, from friends, then family, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Jess was making her rounds, spinning a twisted story where I was the sole villain, the unfaithful husband who betrayed her with her own mother. The phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends we'd shared for years suddenly stopped answering, and a few even texted me, saying they couldn't believe I'd stooped so low. Jess was turning everyone against me, painting me as some kind of monster. She conveniently left out every part of her own betrayal, glossing over her affair with David and positioning herself as the innocent victim. Karen was devastated. She called me almost every day, crying, telling me that Jess had completely cut her off. She wasn't allowed near her own daughter or her future grandchild anymore. Jess had demanded complete silence, refusing to acknowledge her mother at all. It was brutal. As much as I resented Jess for what she'd done, I couldn't ignore Karen's pain. She was caught in the middle, and I could hear the guilt in her voice with every call. Then, one night, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a cold, familiar voice greeted me. It was David. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Matt," he sneered. "But you're insane if you think this is over." I let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't a game, David. You're just as tangled up in this as I am. Or did Jess conveniently forget to tell you about her little affair when she spun you her sob story? Silence on his end told me everything. He hadn't known. Jess had likely spun him the same tale she'd fed to everyone else, making herself look pure as snow. I could almost hear him piecing it all together on the other end. Yeah, I continued, my voice sharp. Jess isn't the innocent victim she's pretending to be. She cheated first, David, with you. So tell me, how does it feel to be her second choice now that her marriage has gone up in flames? He swore under his breath and then hung up. I knew right then that Jess's carefully crafted story was starting to unravel, the truth finally pulling at the edges of her narrative. Later that night, I got a surprising message from Karen. Jess came by. We talked. She knows everything now. I sat there, holding my phone, the weight of it settling on my chest. Jess knew, not just the part she'd chosen to accept, not just her own version of events, but the full truth, her betrayal, mine, Karen's involvement, and the ripple effects we were all living with. I wondered what that knowledge would do to her, whether it might soften her or just fortify her anger. Hours passed, and as I finally crawled into bed, an exhaustion washed over me. The firestorm was still raging, and the truth was out. But instead of bringing any relief, it only seemed to be cutting deeper wounds, one painful truth at a time. The next morning, I woke to a strange calm. After weeks of constant calls, accusations, and tension, there was nothing. No messages, no fallout from the night before. Just silence. It felt unsettling, like the eerie stillness that comes before a storm. Then, around early afternoon, the silence broke. My phone buzzed, and I glanced down to see a text from Jess. Just 3 words. We need closure. I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I agreed to meet her anyway. We picked a quiet cafe, far enough away from our usual spots to avoid anyone who might know us. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, gazing out with an expression I didn't recognize, a kind of calm, maybe even resignation. For a brief moment, she looked almost vulnerable, stripped of the anger that had driven her for weeks. I sat down across from her, and she didn't look up right away. She just took a deep breath, then finally met my eyes, a tired sadness in her expression. I know everything, Matt, she said softly. Mom told me everything.